Lately, I've realized I've been taking woodworking way too seriously. Every project has to make money, hit a deadline, or be the next YouTube video. Somewhere along the way, I stopped building things just because they sounded fun. Growing up, I loved watching people like Adam Savage build ridiculous things on Mythbusters, just because they could. Years later, I found Bobby Duke, and after watching him make his own Maui hook, I remember thinking, I want that too. And here we are, 10 years later. With the new live-action Moana hitting theaters, I finally had an excuse. So today, I'm making one. Not because I need it, not because anyone asked me to, just because it sounds fun. Alright, there we go. Thanks for watching. We could go ahead and just 3D print a bunch of parts, glue them together, and make a massive Maui hook, but Maui's hook is supposed to be a big, heavy artifact. That's why we're gonna make it out of maple. And I'm a woodworker. This is solid. This is not. This is dense and heavy, and it just makes way more sense. And as you can see, wood comes in a variety of natural colors, from reds to oranges, even black. But I think this hard maple is gonna give the most resemblance to like bone. And since I don't have any natural magical whale bones laying around, I think this will do. While I turned a pile of rough maple into something I can actually work with, at this point I still had one pretty important initial problem to solve. What is this thing even supposed to actually look like? And that's easier said than done. I spent way too much time staring at screenshots from the movie, trying to get the proportions right. But you can only get so much information from a flat 2D image you see online. I eventually settled on one reference that I liked the most, and recreated that in Nomad Sculpt. Think of it as digital clay on an iPad. You start out with a blob and slowly shape it into whatever you want. Once I finally had a design I liked, I threw that design into my printer software and printed a miniature version just to see what it would look and feel like in real life, as you saw before. And I'm really glad I did, because changing something that's 10 inches tall is a whole lot easier than changing something that's 4 feet tall. And with the prototype looking good, I brought that model into my CNC software to figure out how this thing was actually going to carve the wood. Even then, I still went through at least 7 different versions before I was happy with the proportions. Something that looks perfect on a computer screen can look completely different once it's nearly 4 feet tall. And that scared me. And back to milling lumber. Since I don't have any massive chunks of maple laying around, you probably noticed I'm gluing together a bunch of pieces to make up this large chunk of wood I need. It took me about all day to get this fully glued together. I would glue a few chunks at a time, let the Titebond cure for about an hour or so, and then glue those chunks to the other chunks and repeat, until we had one final massive glue up left. Yep. It's big. At this point, I was starting to question my decisions. Every time I glued on another piece, this thing just kept getting heavier and heavier. Hard maple is already pretty dense, so by the time this blank measured about 48 inches long, 20 inches wide, and 3 inches thick, moving it around the shop was becoming a workout. Now, I probably could have carved this entire thing by hand with an angle grinder and shaping disc, but that would have taken forever. It also would have made an unbelievable mess, meaning I'd have to do it all outside. And at the time, it was 94 degrees outside with like 105 heat index with poor air quality due to the northern wildfires. So with all that, I was more than happy to let the CNC and dust collector tackle most of the shaping. Besides, this was easily the biggest 3D carve I've ever attempted, and honestly, I was pretty excited to try it out on the CNC. Oh. And since I have a 3-axis CNC, the item you are carving has to be flipped halfway through. The tricky part is making sure it goes back in the exact same position. To do that, I added a couple of alignment dowels. They're basically a cheap insurance policy. If the hook shifts even a fraction of an inch when it's flipped over, the front and back won't line up. After spending around $60 on this maple and a full day or so getting to this point, that's not really a mistake I wanted to make. And once everything was lined back up and clamped in, it was time to let the machine do the exact same carve all over again, just reversed. Y'all ready for this? Dun, 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 dun. Oh man, man for scale. Sit. Good boy, stay. As you could probably tell, I was getting pretty excited on how this thing was turning out. Seeing it carved out of this giant block of wood almost looked like uncovering some type of fossil buried inside, which was pretty neat. A smaller version of this, cleaned up a little, would look pretty cool sitting on a desk or bookshelf. And for those wondering how long it took the CNC to carve this, it was about 1 hour per side, so roughly 2 hours total. This would for sure have taken me more than a day to do without a CNC. And now that we released the beast of a hook from its wooden shell, we still have a lot of shaping to do with some hand sanders. And as you can see right about here, there's a pretty ugly line running through the middle of the hook. That's because the CNC couldn't efficiently reach all the way down to those edges. So there was still quite a bit of cleanup left to do. I spent a good amount of time smoothing out those areas, and then I busted out my bigger, more aggressive sander to dial in the rest of the shaping I wasn't completely happy with. And now it's the following day, and I think and hope the hardest parts are behind us. I spent way more time sanding this than I anticipated. I left a little extra meat on the bone in these areas just so I could kind of feather those down naturally, but I left too much. I still could have taken more off in these areas, but it's also wood and I don't want it to become fragile. So overall, I think we're good where we're at. And then I'm gonna start putting all the designs on here by hand. I've never done any sort of like small hand engraving, so we'll see how that goes. I bought this thing because it seemed like the right tool for the job, but it looks pretty dainty and I hope it has enough power, so we'll see. I hope I can do this in several hours versus like 8 to 10. And just take a second to look how massive this thing is. I'm gonna have to weigh it, but it is absolutely huge. I cannot wait to put all the details on it. And this was probably the most intimidating part of the entire build. I really hadn't put much thought into it until I was sitting there staring at a blank hook and a few references of Maui's hook, thinking, dang, I'm really gonna have to freehand all this. I mean, how in the world would I even stencil something like this? Luckily, if you look closely at Maui's hook, it's almost like someone just doodled a bunch of carvings into the giant bone. It was detailed, but not so detailed that every line had to be perfect. After a little trial and error and a whole lot of winging it, the hook slowly started filling up with the drawings, and I thought they looked pretty decent, especially for someone who wouldn't consider themselves good at drawing. I've always liked to doodle and make little sketches, but actually sitting down and drawing was never something I felt I was really good at. Unless I was supposed to be paying attention in class, then I was suddenly an artist. And I really did start feeling like an artist when I busted out the rotary tool and started attacking this thing. I think this part took me around 6 hours. And it was definitely intimidating because I knew I could ruin this thing in a hurry. But after doing a few practice carvings on some scrap pieces, I built the confidence I needed. And then it became a matter of taking it slow and following the doodles I had sketched out earlier, making them disappear one line at a time. Before I knew it, I was done. And I got exactly what I wanted out of this build. There was never really reason to make it other than the fact that I wanted to. I wanted to challenge myself by doing something I knew I wasn't going to be very good at. Growing up, I loved watching shows like Mythbusters, Junkyard Wars, and anything where people were just building ridiculous things because they thought it would be fun. Then years later, YouTube introduced me to people like Bobby Duke, who were doing the same exact thing, just making cool, random projects and unapologetically being themselves. When Jess and I started our business years ago, my goal was pretty simple. I wanted to be, air quotes, successful, which if you've owned a business for any amount of time, you know it's a constantly evolving definition. But I also wanted a shop of tools that were paid for and capable of building whatever crazy idea popped into my head, whether it was out of wood, metal, or something entirely different. I don't know if 12-year-old me imagined I'd someday have a shop capable of making things like this, or half the things I build on a regular basis, but I'm pretty sure he would think it's pretty awesome. Honestly, I think we all need to make or do something completely unnecessary once in a while. Dig out that old Game Boy you used to love playing. Build something you've always wanted to try. Or go hike that trail you haven't been on in 3 years because life got busy. We spend way too much time trying to be productive. Sometimes you should just make or do something. Just because. And just like that, we're wrapping this thing up with the final detail. I tried to dye the twine slightly as I didn't want it to look new and fresh. I wanted it to look like it was hanging off Maui's shoulder for a little while and had some age to it. I've always actually kind of liked knots, so I actually tied a proper knot, where you cinch the knot down inside of the wrap and cut off the excess. I also used a touch of hot glue to hold it in place while I was tying it. And then everyone loves a little fire, so I utilized the torch to burn off the wispies, and it started giving it a more aged look, so I kept going a little further. Overall, there's some things I'd changed or have done slightly different, but I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. All right, we're done, and it's pretty heavy, but I think I got an idea.